share. At this time, I'd like to turn today's program over to Gary Simmons. Mr. Simmons, you may begin.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very interesting topic, inclusive leadership. And also, we're delighted here at the Mercer Women's Network, the VINE, to be jointly hosting this with the European Professional Women's Network. Just a word of apology. A couple of weeks ago, we tried to run this session, and we had the most appalling technological issues, so really, really sorry about that. But here we are live, so move on. Just a little bit of word about myself. I'm a client relationship manager at Mercer. I also get involved in one or two of our strategic initiatives, and I've been in the consulting industry well over 31 years now, and have started life as in the financial side as an actuary, and moved into sort of broader things, including along the way leadership and sort of culture change. And that was started really by my own development work I've been doing, plus challenges I got at around the age of 40 as I got my first senior management role, and was sort of slightly surprised, but not for very long, that people didn't do what they said they would do. And also at about this time, or at the turn of the century in 2000, in a previous existence, we started looking at the gender diversity issue, and very seriously. And it struck me, and this was again based on my own work, myself, my own thoughts, that the gender aspect was important, but so was the inner feminine and the inner masculine that was inside us, and bring all those fruits to bear in the workplace. I raised this in board committee and got a complete deck of blank looks. So it was very refreshing when mine and Cora Lynn's path crossed some years ago, to see that these themes are being picked up. And so Cora Lynn, I'm delighted to welcome to talk through inclusive leadership and her work. Now, Cora Lynn and I do share a little bit of a past in that we both started in a financial sense and moved on to different things. Her path has taken her into leadership development in I say, a very big way. She's had appointments at Aston and Cranfield Business School. She's worked with a range of leading companies in the cosmetic business to the nuclear business in L'Oreal and British Nuclear Fuels, and has written 3 books, including the recent Ready for Change. I think without further ado, I think, Cora Lynn, would you like to take us along?
Thank you, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to try and do this in about 18 to 20 minutes. Time me if you'd like, because I'd like to leave time for questions and answers at the end. At the end of the day, if we're talking about inclusive leadership, I want to include you. So let me put that on the table and hold myself accountable for that from the start. So inclusive leadership. Is the future of leadership feminine? And I am pressing the forward arrow on the system, but it's not working. So let me see if I can be helped on this to take us to the next slide. There we go. Thank you very much, Nicole. So those who know me know that technology is not my forte. Just a couple of quotes to get us going to start with. And I love this one from John Scott's book he wrote in 2010 called The Difference. And he says, diversity without inclusion drives division. Success belongs to those who foster inclusion, inclusive collaboration to enhance creativity and innovation. What does that mean? It means that they seek out diverse perspectives. 2, that they actively create a workplace in which diverse talent is fostered. 3, that they understand the link between diversity, inclusion, and higher business performance. Those 3 planks are the planks of my model on inclusive leadership that I shall share with you. I have to say that at the end of this webinar, I will show you a list of some of my prime sources. Over 40 items in this have contributed to this point of view of thinking. So more on that later. Again, the system doesn't seem to be wanting to cooperate. But let me continue. The first of these two characteristics, the fact that people seek out, who are inclusive, seek out diverse perspectives, and the fact that they actively create a workplace in which diverse talent is fostered. Those two items, if you could go back, those two items are part of a cluster of characteristics that Gerd Hofstede and Gilles Spooney say are feminine. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think even from the start, I want to plant that thought. And therefore, the question is, could it be that the future of leadership is feminine? Before any of you, particularly, especially the men, get really irate and clock off, I am not saying that feminine is the exclusive prerogative of women. Let me come back to that later on. So my next slide. What is inclusive leadership? I'd like you to submit, please, for our research, and we'll come back to this later on, what for you are the characteristics of an inclusive leader? When someone says, that is an inclusive leader, what does that mean to you? Just one or two characteristics. If you could submit it, I've got a group of 3 people here ready to take notes. So even as I go on, please do tell me, in your opinion, finish the sentence, an inclusive leader is ... I'm going to go on. There's a context for inclusive leadership. It doesn't just come out of the ether. And the context is that we need to drive the bottom line. Following the financial crisis of 2007 and with the joy that Osborne must see the new productivity and growth rates in England, the reality is that we all need to grow our bottom line. Wonderful survey from Catalyst on performance of boards identified that the Fortune 500 companies that have 3 or more women on board have enhanced performance. Specifically, an increase of 73% return on sales, an increased 83% return on equity, a total whopping 112% increased return on invested capital. The jury is out, some would say, whether that is just because they brought diverse talent into the boardroom, i.e. women, where the board was mainly men, or because it was the women themselves, the nature of female leadership as opposed to male leadership. I want to be honest and plant that, but nevertheless, this is the results. Fortune 500 companies with 3 or more women on board have higher performance. Another piece of research done by Opportunity Now, Business in the Community, identified that inclusion in the workplace leads to greater motivation. 84% of respondents said their inclusive leader made them more motivated. Greater loyalty, 83% said their inclusive leaders made them more loyal. And a greater desire to go beyond their day job, beyond the responsibilities that were written in black and white. 81% said their inclusive leader motivated them to go above and beyond the call of duty. Imagine if you could do that within your workplaces. Imagine if we could do that within our workplaces. So let me continue. The context for inclusive leadership isn't new. Drucker, the Drucker Foundation, celebrated their 100th anniversary a year ago, 2 years ago. And Drucker himself said that effective work is actually done in and by teams of diverse people, of people with diverse knowledge and skills. I love the fact that she actually identifies that the cognitive skills required to be brilliant at one task often overlap little with the skills required for another. If you look further afield, you realize that what does intelligence look like? Well, if you look at Howard Gardner, there are 7 types or dimensions of intelligence. If you look at Robert Sternberg, there are 3. Either way, the fact is intelligence is not just about IQ. And if you want to bring different intelligences to bear to enhance creativity, we need to be inclusive of those different sources of intelligence. Again, a quote which I love from the CEO of AIG. We all know AIG was almost broken in 2007, 2008 with the Lehman Brothers collapse and all that came with that. The new CEO says, and I'll quote this almost in full, one of our great opportunities as we rebuild AIG is to create a more diverse and inclusive company that fosters full engagement of our individual and organizational capabilities. Diversity of people, ideas, and skills is essential for us to continue building our competitive advantage. Diversity is not only the right thing to do, but also must form the heart of our viability as a great company that attracts and retains the best people. So, how does this fit in with, I mentioned other types of intelligence, how does this fit in with emotional intelligence, of which we all have heard a lot over the past few years? This is based on Daniel Goleman's work. And the model will be familiar to many of you, but let me posit that what we first see of people are their social skills. How good is Gary at interacting with people? How good is he at engaging with people in a room, working the room, networking the room? That's what we see. We first see his social skills. Behind that, if we look a little bit closer, we see a refined man, very self-regulated, charming but controlling his impulses. Question, that's the actions we see. What's behind that? Well, I would suggest, as Goleman suggests, that behind that is a deep bank of empathy to engage with others, and that's what fuels and drives the social skills. But behind it all, and actually behind the self-regulation that impacts on the empathy, is this concept of self-awareness. So that is key to an inclusive leader. And you'll see how that in itself makes the inclusive leader vulnerable. Before I get to that, though, another quote, this time from September 2013, so extraordinarily recent, from the Center for Talent Innovation. Note that the word innovation comes up again. What does it take to win in the global marketplace? All of us are going for productivity, but what does it take to win in the global marketplace? Serial innovation that drives and sustains growth. What drives serial innovation? A diverse workforce. Inclusive leader behaviors effectively unlock the innovative potential of an inherently diverse workforce. So let me just get to the point. What do I believe? My research suggests is an inclusive leader. An inclusive leader is someone who does three things, who has three attributes. I will argue with you that if one of these attributes is missing, we don't have an inclusive leader. We have another type of leader, and I'll get to that in a minute. Gary said in the introduction that he was surprised early on in his leadership career when he realized people don't do what they say they would do. Might have been a slip of the tongue. I don't think it was, looking at him sideways. I believe that's largely because people don't adapt. We say something when we confront it with something else. Actually, we can't move from what we said we would do, but nor can we adapt to the situation in which we find ourselves. That, I hope, isn't a contradiction. So an inclusive leader is adaptable, self-aware, open about, and manages their own personal natural biases. They're also curious. They are interested and enjoy the company of different others. In other words, they keep a window open on themselves to be willing and able to change. Why? Because they are also engaging. They involve other people actively and sensitively with a strong sense of cross-boundary conversations. They invite the ideas and inputs of others. They like provocative environments. Why? Because they believe that in so doing, they build high-performing teams. Not incremental performance teams, but high-performance teams. Third item, they're focused on results. They're visionary. They direct diversity, which could be divisive, to a common purpose. And they provoke fresh thinking and creativity and innovation to serve that common goal. They align people towards clear deliverables by focusing on a coherent vision. That is not easy. Particularly that top one of being adaptable. It's very hard if you come from a collectivist nation, if you come from the part of the world that is ex-communist or Arabic or African in its origins, and I'll substantiate this with a reconfigured map of the world in a minute. But let me be controversial, because if the adaptable part of this model is missing, what you have is transformational leadership. And that's great, because transformational is a whole heap better than transactional. But a transformational leader, nothing in that model speaks about being malleable as an individual. The inclusive leader is malleable. Because he's malleable, he is faced with a challenge of being seen as weak in some parts of the world, he, she. Yeah? So let me be controversial again. Let me suggest that Iran's new president, Hassan Rouhani, who had the audacity to say Happy New Year to the Israelites and to say to Obama, let's have a coffee, and actually then led to a telephone call, I was going to say a coffee call, telephone call on October the 2nd with President Obama. I suggest that President Hassan Rouhani is an inclusive leader. I suggest Obama is as well. Let me be even more controversial. I suggest that President Netanyahu has allowed himself, even for a moment, when he said, I'm prepared to talk to Rouhani on the phone, to contemplate the possibility of being adaptable. What's the end result? Well, hopefully, a narrowing of Iran's nuclear activity to that which can serve the civil purpose, and an end, hopefully, to far-reaching sanctions. I just want to plant that thought. You can think of the contrast. Perhaps, dare I propose, Syria's Assad and even more controversial, Russia's Vladimir Putin. I move on. So what does this model look like? Well, it looks like a bumblebee. And I'm going to ask as I explain this model, how the challenges that you face within your organization are informed by this model. Do you know that a bumblebee cannot fly? That it has been aerodynamically tested, and the aerodynamic experts say the bumblebee cannot fly. Its wings are too little and too light to carry that massive body. So some would say that an inclusive leader won't fly, won't achieve their results. They're too flexible or too malleable and waste too much time in including other people to achieve their goals and results. I suggest not. The research suggests that we'd better make sure that this bumblebee of an inclusive leader flies. And let me explain why. Let me continue to build on this. Quotes from role models. Inclusive leadership starts with self-awareness, being introspective, knowing your blind spots, and possessing the ability to listen and learn. So there's you have my adaptable, starting with self-awareness. Matching that in equal proportion, an inclusive leader is interested in others. They care for people and are willing to listen. It's not just a care born in the heart, it's a care born in the head. I care about what you're saying because you know what you're saying will inform and make me think differently about my objectives. But ultimately, an inclusive leader, and this is where the hard meets the soft, where that massive body comes in. An inclusive leader is a synergist that sparks the team to head in the direction that it needs to go. And we all know how difficult that is. But look at what Google has done. Google has embraced this thinking way back from its origins and said that they are looking, this is part of their recruitment criteria, looking for people with broad knowledge and expertise, not generally, not in just about every dimension, in many different areas of computing science and mathematics. So that's how they hone in on the goal and the objective. But what they're saying is they also want people with diverse interests and skills. And I love this, that ability matters as much as diversity. I would almost want to turn it around, that maybe diversity matches, diversity matches as much as ability. What about Apple? And these, by the way, are the two most valuable brands in the world at this point in time, unless something has happened in the last 2 weeks since my research on that. Apple's corporate logo, think different. In difference lies the opportunity and the potential to contribute. So, have you ever seen the world configured as this, ladies and gentlemen? This is a reconfigured map of the world based on the data of Gerd Hofstede, reconfigured by a great colleague of mine called Gilles Spooney, did his PhD in Cranfield, and repurposed by me for a 1-minute questionnaire that I created last year for individuals to identify what drives success at work, where they place value for success at work. Let me just talk you into this. 5 groupings, clusters of nations: the Anglo-Saxons, Ireland, UK, USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada; the Nordics, southeast, Estonia to Sweden; the Latins, bang in the middle, from Italy down to Slovenia and Italy; the ex-communist, Arabic, and collectivist nations, where you see China, Hong Kong, Thailand, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the Germanic nations of Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. Japan on its own, up at the top. What this says is, if you understand the way we approach work, where we place value for success at work, it divides into along two large dimensions. One is how we approach the relationships. 2 is how we approach the task. I'm not going to go through this in detail. If you'd like to know more, please contact us. I'd be delighted to explore it with you. But what we're trying to say is, on the dimensions of the relationships and how the different peoples in different nation states divide, some pursue relationships with a masculine approach. Masculine and feminine are Hofstede's terminology, not mine, not Mercer's. Don't kill the messenger, please. Masculine approach to relationships says it's about me. It's about how I can drive results, how I can achieve, and how I can persuade. The more I know, the more senior people, the more I am able to drive for results, the more I'm able to achieve personally, the more I am able to persuade. That's a masculine approach to relationships. A feminine approach to relationships says, actually, I want to work in a team. It's the team that achieves the results. It's collectively, by moderating our views, by facilitating our work together and as individuals, and by taking a humanist approach of wanting to know, Gary, what drives your thinking about inclusion? Gary, what made you go into finance? And Gary, what made you go out of finance and into the world of consulting, of general consulting? That humanist approach builds loyalty, builds inclusion. And that's why we are suggesting that the future of leadership is feminine. Just one point before I leave this slide. The world is going southeast, not because the Nordics are there, but because of our individualistic approach, segmentation of one, customization to each individual on this planet. The world and our leadership is forcing us to go southeast towards pro-change and towards consideration of others. So what are the hallmarks of an inclusive leader? An inclusive leader is someone who solicits and diverse people, brings them in. An inclusive leader creates an inclusive environment by creating safe places that enables people to recognize differences by reducing social isolation. Thirdly, and as an example of an inclusive environment, and there are more examples, an inclusive environment is one where clarity and transparency around shared meaning exists. So we know what our purpose is. We know what our goals are. We know what's expected of us. We know what our responsibilities and our accountabilities are. This is at the heart of empowerment, an inclusive environment. Second hallmark, an inclusive leader fosters inclusive practice. And I love this quote. I've been using it since the 1990s. There's nothing so unequal as the equal treatment of unequals. If you could see Gary and I, you'd recognize that this mountain of a man, elegant man, is 6'1", 6'2". I'm just under 5 foot. So wouldn't it be ridiculous for me to say that I deserve as much cloth for my suit as Gary does? There's nothing so unequal as the equal treatment of unequals. And an inclusive leader recognizes that in terms of their practice at work. An inclusive leader also confronts the challenge that in reality, unless we have a shared goal to which we cohere our diversity of thinking, diversity divides, pulls us apart, and that is what that equation says. Thirdly, an inclusive practice says, how are we building inclusive leadership across the rank and file and through the bowels of our organization, at the level of our graduates, at the level of our three-year leader, 25, 28, 30-year-old leader at the level of our partners and vice presidents, at the level of our group board. Third hallmark of an inclusive leader, I'm not an expert on the neuroscience, but my reading and my beginnings of reading suggest that our minds are reconfigured by every new experience we have. New pathways are created, and diverse leaders recognize that. And instead of being afraid of new experiences, actually send their people out, provoke others to have new experiences. So not only do they themselves become adaptable and make themselves adaptable with the vulnerability that that brings in, but they encourage their people to also be adaptable. Finally, fourth hallmark, and I'm almost at the end, you'll be hopefully pleased, but not too pleased to hear. Fourth hallmark of an inclusive leader is that they embrace the fact that different people have different inclinations towards inclusion. Take FireBee. I don't know how many of you are familiar with FireBee. It's a tool to understand who would work well in a submariner environment, in a submarine. Think pressurized can, many miles under the sea for months at a time. You don't want to put people in there who have a great capacity to explode with each other. So you measure three things according to this tool. One of them is inclusion. How inclusive are you willing to be with others? How inclusive do you want others to be with you? So all I posit is that not all of us have the same approach and desire for inclusion, inclusivity, and we need to recognize that. I had a boss once who said to me, Cora Lynn, do you realize what my score is on desired inclusion, wanted inclusion? I said, no, I did. She said, 0. The reality is, if you knew me, my desire for inclusion is, on a scale of 1 to 9, probably about 8. Real challenge on my time. So I needed to understand that for me to be inclusive of her meant I needed to send her few emails, the fewer the better. That was me expressing inclusion of her rather than dumping on her. So important to understand different people have different capacities and desire for inclusion. Secondly, our own model, Mercer's model of leadership, which talks about whole leadership, whole leaders. Whole leaders are people who use their head, use their heart, use their guts. It comes out of a piece of research we did amongst Fortune 500 companies, the quote there for you to read. What I say is, what I posit is that as inclusive leaders, we've got to think with our heads, why do we want to be inclusive? And I suggest it is because we want to cohere people around a shared goal. With our heart, we have to ask, how can we be inclusive? And that is embracing and welcoming people, letting them know that we care about what they have to say. And with our guts, we have to say, how willing am I to be adaptable so that the inclusive environment I create is not based on my idea of what that inclusive environment looks like, but on the idea of what we believe that inclusive environment looks like. Ladies and gentlemen, in sameness we connect, but in difference we grow. That is it.
Wonderful.
My references. Shall I go back to, shall I leave it there?
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Cora Lynn. I think we should hand it over to some questions. Do we have any on the phone lines?
As a reminder, if you'd like to ask an audio question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. You may also ask a question through your web console. Locate the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in and click send to submit. Operator, do you have any audio questions on the line?
There are no audio questions at this time.
We have a number on the that have you've kindly typed in. So I think we're going to try and.
Yeah, they are.
So let me welcome, whilst you guys, let me welcome some of these. Gary, can you and I do this?
Yeah.
So I'm hearing that inclusive leaders build diverse teams and ensure that everyone is heard. Great. That talks into that second angle, I would suggest, wouldn't you, Gary, of welcoming and embracing diversity. And that came from Yvonne. Thank you, Yvonne. From Georgia, inclusive leadership is active listening and consistently considering the different opinions and different people to take decisions. Again, I love the fact that you've got don't you, Gary, about the decision being the end goal of inclusion in
yep.
And
both adaptable and both engaging.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. And then from Siobhan, our great colleague, we've got an inclusive leader is someone who takes an open stance and seeks input from others, other than the usual suspects. Again, taking off the blinkers. What do you think of that, Gary?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because it's you mentioned. And I'm still sort of turning this over. I rather like being a vulnerable man mountain. And the interesting thing here is going outside what is familiar and what are the normal sort of rules of a game in an organization is kind of scary. It does take a bit of a step. You do have to make yourself vulnerable. And therefore, it's kind of, if you go to the usual suspects, you're kind of pretty sure what you're going, and it is a, potentially if you're looking for validation, you're probably going to get the validation you're going to expect, but actually, is that taking you down the same path and you go around the same loop again? Is it actually the challenge you need to be different and step into that, take you down a different loop?
Mm-hmm. So really good question that's come in. What are the main practical tips you'd like us to take away and start implementing in our day-to-day work? Gary, what would you take away? As he was about to put a bottle of water to
I was just about to have a sip, actually.
Practical tips.
I think it depends the degree you want to do it, and I think I'm as guilty as others of perhaps not going to seek opinions of colleagues that I think might give different views. I think I'm very good when those views come in. I'm very good to be reactive to them, but I question how proactive I am to go to people that I wouldn't normally connect with who would have different views and so on. And I think, to me, a practical step is just, things that embed change are little things that you do and reinforce and reinforce. So for me, that would be a start, is just to reach out more and just bounce ideas off people that you would not normally do so, who are likely to give you different views.
Good. Great.
And I say, when I've done that, some really interesting things have happened.
Yeah, so
I'm really glad I did it.
So reaching out to, let me build on that. A practical tip is to, I put in a final, just before something is finalized, I put in a question of, is there anyone else I should be consulting on this? So that's one practical tip. Are you asking yourself, and are you putting into your process, into your gate, is there anyone else I need to consult on this? And making time for that. Secondly, we know that in the context of change, there are always resistors. And I ask myself, as an inclusive leader, a tip would be, do I go to those who I know are resistors, who have high power and high interest in what I'm proposing? And do I place the ideas, do I involve them from the start by saying, can I bounce something off of you? This might not seem natural to you, but can I bounce it off of you? So that's something that I do. Frenny, any ideas?
I would just probably, actually agreeing with Gary, is that you generally tend to go to people that, for advice, the same people that you go to on a daily basis. I would agree, you need to go to different people, different levels of seniority, people that you work outside your current business, and approach them for their advice. I find I've always received the best advice from people that I don't work with on a daily basis. So people that are completely different to my current role, not in my business line, not in my function, and I've always got the best advice to them because I think they can give the most honest advice and be very open. Mm-hmm. That was one of the things I would say.
Great. Nicole?
I probably have more an additional question. How do you actually practically deal with someone you report to who you realize likes to manage people who will tell them what they want to hear and what's safe, right? So how do you deal with someone who, you might be very different, the ideas you're thinking, and even you try to adapt, you realize that they might not be as open to different ideas, and maybe they don't even see it themselves, but you can tell there's a pattern of if people tell them what they want to hear, that seems convenient, happy, and stress-free. So maybe what would be interesting to hear how you can deal in that situation in a practical way.
So you're almost suggesting that you would like to be an inclusive person, and you're dealing with someone who doesn't come across as an inclusive leader.
Yes.
Okay. So, as an in the context of inclusive leadership, I would encourage you to find out what drives them, and let's assume that what drives them is performance. Yep. So I would angle your ideas from the point of view of this might be, you might start with saying, this is a completely left-wing idea, but I've got some thoughts that might improve our ability to perform, and I'm not saying they're right, but may have positioned them to you. So hook onto what matters to them. And I've put back up on the slide, on the screen, slide 13, that talks about inclusive practice, and it also speaks to hints. Well, there are 3 hints down at the bottom. I think the first 2 are particularly powerful. Particularly, I say, is the second one. So, how do you focus in on the big picture and ask, what do we need to do differently in order to achieve this big picture? And how can I invite the widest possible range of ideas to help us think creatively about achieving this big picture?
So you focus on the outcome,
yes,
or the potential outcome,
yes,
and engage from there.
Yeah. Would you add? Would you?
Well, I was struck by one of the questions that's come up, which I think is connected.
Does that help?
Yes. No, thank you.
I think it's like looking the opposite. We have a question here, which says, is it possible to be very successful without inclusive? And examples given of Steve Jobs and the Duke of Wellington.
Very different examples. Okay, so the Duke of Wellington, I presume you're talking about the historical Duke of Wellington.
Yes.
Well, the Duke of Wellington lived in a very different era to ours, where command and control applied. He was also a man of the military, where we know command structures even today are very strong and clear. I argue with my military friends that it's very easy for a general to go down and have dinner in the mess with his foot soldiers and still go back out and be the general. Nobody will question his authority because he's deemed, he's lowered himself to the rank and files. There was never a question of who the Duke of Wellington was and that he had command and control. In today's world of increasing individualism and low or no hierarchy, it's very hard to simply command people and have them obey. You've got to win people's desire to do things. If not, the best will walk with their feet. And we know that from the millennial population, but also from the Gen Y. Today's young people want to be persuaded, want to be won over. So I think the Duke of Wellington was great situationally for his time and his place. I also suggest that there is, in not every situation, in this situational leadership, not every situation does inclusive leadership work. If there's a fire in the building, I don't want Gary to go around or me to go around asking, what should we do, what are your ideas? You know, the command and control. Yeah, you just say, it's time to go, and you go in directive mode. So there are times to be directive. Inclusive leadership, one of the drawbacks is it takes time. Sometimes you don't have the luxury of that time. So we could talk more about the Duke of Wellington, but those are just a couple of ideas on the Duke of Wellington. With regard to Steve Jobs, he actually surrounded himself. If you look at the board of Apple right now, it's very white Anglo-Saxon male. That is the truth. And maybe Steve Jobs' sad departure will be seen, will see itself through Apple's ability or inability to create new products that really capture the imagination of us as buyers as much as they did before when Steve Jobs was around. But the point is, Steve Jobs himself was an incredibly diverse individual. His love for calligraphy inspired his visualization and his love of aesthetics, things that were aesthetic. He invited and welcomed people's ideas. He loved creativity, and in that sense, arguably, Steve Jobs is very inclusive, but non-compromising on certain standards, and that's where the goal, that's where that body of the bumblebee comes in. His goal and his standards were non-compromisable. I don't know if that speaks into that question completely. Your question is great.
I think it's a very good question because, the Wellington example, war is win or lose. It's particularly in those days. It's a very clear outcome you're striving through. And I think, what you're saying about Steve Jobs is he was a complex individual with a lot of these traits. And I think some of the way he interacted with people does seem a little bit different. But again, it was very successful. But again, now what? But it's interesting the moves that Apple have just been making in hiring in the CEO of Burberry to look at the market side. So there's some very interesting hiring, I think.
Indeed, addressing this issue. Another question that's arisen is how inclusive is it when we say that the future of leadership is feminine? How do we focus on developing women but build an inclusive team? Well, those are two separate questions. But at the heart is we're not, and of course we're not suggesting that the whole team should be women. And forgive me if I didn't make this as clear as I should have. I believe that there are women who display very strong masculine characteristics. Let me give you some examples. Benazir Bhutto, Aung San Suu Kyi, very feminine in her look, but very strong and resolute and resilient during her years and years of house arrest. Angela Merkel, our very own Margaret Thatcher, Indira Gandhi, these were not soft women. For Margaret Thatcher's pearls and her handbag, that lady was not for turning. Yeah? Let me, by contrast, suggest that there are great men who display inner femininity. Example, and I'm being a bit controversial perhaps, I've already suggested Hassan Rouhani, and I've already suggested Barack Obama. Hassan Rouhani in his culture of Arab men who don't bend, who don't reach out, perhaps, who are servants of their people and their religion. This man reached out. Isn't that a feminine trait? David Cameron, how committed is he to his family? And during the sad loss of his son, of his disabled son, did we not as a nation see a man mourn deeply when he lost his father in very short pursuit? Did we not see the feminine qualities of David Cameron? Let me go back a little bit more. Mikhail Gorbachev, wasn't he a man who reached out, of whom Margaret Thatcher said, this is the man with whom we can do business? Not very popular, as I understand it, in Russia right now, because he's seen as the one who brought down the wall. And I'm going to be even more controversial. Don't we, when we think about Ronald Reagan, think about the feminine qualities of the man, his ability to reach out, to laugh at himself? So I'm not suggesting at all when I say that the future of leadership is feminine. I'm not suggesting at all that it is for women only. I'm suggesting that it pulls out the feminine in us to be able to reach out and accommodate others, to embrace and be the creator, the considerer of others, who creates a family environment where others can really reach their potential. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense to me, and I just a sort of comment. I believe a film is being made of the famous Reykjavik meeting between Gorbachev and Reagan, and I do remember that unfolding in, I think, 85, 86. And it's interesting because I was very frightened, I have to say, when Reagan came to power because of the very military talk and it's very easy to forget now how close it felt at times to World War III and nuclear Armageddon. But you could argue that Reagan, the history books say, stepped out to break the Soviet Union by economic means, and actually did that. And Gorbachev reached out and said, we can't compete anymore. We need to do a deal. And they both met the deal. And I think, I don't know when this film is going to come out, but I think it'd be interesting to see if it treats it, and be interesting to look at those feminine and masculine characteristics the two actors play in that. So hopefully.
So let me just add also to that. We as Mercer are working with Libya, with some of the most senior leaders and some of the most significant organizations in Libya. And I have the incredible honor, I'm very humbled to lead our team as we work with these guys. And what I'm realizing is even in Libya, they have huge issues of getting people to follow, particularly now that the Libyans have borne arms after 42 years of dictatorship where there was only one leader, and that was Muammar Gaddafi. Now everyone's a leader. So why should they comply? Why should they work? They want salary, but why should they work? And the people who are coming from Libya are struggling with this and are actually asking, how can we lead in a manner that isn't just command and control, which is what we're used to? We have to be strong. We have to be seen as strong leaders. But if all we do is command and try to control, we're not going to get anywhere, because these people literally have borne arms to free themselves. We need to find a way of being able to win them over, to persuade them, to include them, particularly those who are still operating in militias. We need to find a way of including them so they buy in, so they feel empowered not to take arms against us, but to work with us to recreate our great nation. So even in a very hard place like Libya right now, the leaders have to find a way of being more inclusive, bringing in diverse points of view towards a common goal. The biggest challenge there is, how do they cohere people around the common goal, and what is the common goal? Even if it's clear to us that the common goal is to rebuild Libya, the detail, the granularity of that is not clear.
Okay, I think we've just got 5 minutes. We've got one more question I think we can take, and then I think we need to look at wrapping up.
We've got 2 questions, so let's see if we can deal with the first one quickly, which is, when we're working in male-dominated environments, how can we encourage feminine traits of these men to come to the surface? Can you give some practical examples? We always have to start, what's in it for the other person? What gets them going? What meets their need? And if we can hook into that, and that's about us being adaptable, starting off with being adaptable, we can actually encourage greater diversity of ideas. If they see that what we're doing contributes to their success, we win them over to the concept of diverse thinking. We might not turn them into inclusive leaders, but we help them understand how an inclusive environment adds value to them. That's a quick suggestion.
Yes, I mean, just a sort of view on that. I mean, my own sort of thoughts on this were that in the environments I've worked in, my women colleagues are the natural teachers for me of the feminine side, and my male colleagues are the natural teachers of the masculine side. And I've had to learn both, actually. Yeah. And again, it's just sort of personal from my perspective that I think, again, it comes down to being prepared to be vulnerable. I think from a man perspective, to listen to that side, I think you have to make yourself a little bit vulnerable, but it's worth, feeling the fear and doing it anyway.
Yeah. Let me just add one more. Thank you, Gary. Let me just add one more practical tip. You can't ask someone else to be inclusive if you're not inclusive. I don't think you can. So to what extent do I model inclusion? Do I go and I ask that boss, that male boss, that very, or female boss, because I've met some very female leaders who are very masculine in their approach. Do I go and ask them their opinion? Do I go and offer them my ideas and say, what are your thoughts? Do I include their ideas into my thinking? So do I model it? And that's a practical example of something I have to do all of the time. Moving to the last question, based on slide 11, which we'll go to.
Which is the map of the world.
The map of the world,
the
yes.
repositioned map of the world.
Is there a different approach that needs to be taken in the different clusters and types of companies? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is at the heart of my 1-minute questionnaire. If you want to know more, please contact me. All I will say is that there are 12 polls that identify where you place value at work. And in fact, those 12 polls are at the end of 6 dilemmas, 3 appertaining to how we approach the relationship, 3 appertaining, so that's the vertical, how we approach the relationship, 3 appertaining to how we approach the task, the horizontal. And very clearly and very quickly you can understand what we need to do, how we need to flex our behavior. Part of me being an inclusive leader is that I'm adaptable. Yeah, back to that first criteria. How do I flex my behavior? What's my repertoire of behavior when I reach out to people from different nation states? What is absolutely sure is, without denying my authenticity, Irene, without being something inauthentic, I can't just say, take me as I am, because this is who I am. I have to say, this is my preference, but let me understand how you would like us to progress as we work together. I hope that helps, Irene. Gary.
Okay. On that note, we need to draw this to a close. I think just on that point, I think having done the 1-minute questionnaire, I think it's essential when you're working overseas to understand this. Really is. I just wanted to thank Cora Lynn, in particular, my colleagues in the room, Nicole, Amanda, and Frenny, and Dominique and her team out there on the West Coast that have put this together very successfully. And just to say that the next session we have is on the 19th of November with John Gazima at Mercer, and he's talking about his book, The Athena Doctrine, which sounds, well, the title sounds very interesting, so I'm certainly up for that. And I just wanted to thank all of you for joining the call and for your questions and your insights, and again, thank you very much. Dominique, would you like to bring it to a close?
Thank you again for joining us today. This does formally conclude today's web conference. You may now disconnect.